and currently is a PhD candidate in the Department of CSE of IIT Kanpur. His areas of interest lies in cryptography, blockchains, and formal verification of smart contracts and blockchain protocols. He has been working as a senior student researcher associate in the National Blockchain Project since October 2018. Prior to joining this PhD graduate, he is a graduate from IIT Kanpur and worked for 5.5 years in NPTC, which is the India's largest power producer, and got experience in the managing critical infrastructure. We feel honored to have you for this session, sir. Over to you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Professor Gururaj for putting so much effort and making this webinar a successful one. So I'll start with my presentation. Let me share one. So is it visible now?
Yes, it's visible. You can go ahead.
Yeah. So I'll off my video and I'll start with presentation. Okay. So I'll be presenting on blockchain basics. So we all know that blockchain revolution came to public's view after Bitcoin arrived in 2009, and it took some time for Bitcoin to get its stronghold. So maybe in later 2015, people started realizing the power of Bitcoin. So all it did was converting this physical currency into a purely digital currency. That too without a centralized agency or a centralized bank. To know that this digitization of money was a big problem, people were doing putting so much effort, like using smart cards, using internet banking, but they were not able to remove this centralized agency. So let's start with the motivation why this is important. So we'll begin with the very basic how this economy of money started. So in beginning there was barter system. This is exchange of goods. So if I have a loaf of bread and you have a packet of wheat, and if you need bread and I need wheat, we'll both come together and exchange it. This was like a very primitive system, and it has a major drawback that you need a dual want of need. You must need the thing which I have, and I must need the thing which you have. Then only we can exchange it. There was no market. It have to be a person-to-person exchange. This is a primitive system. To improve on this system, the later governments or kings, they introduced gold coins, or a coin which have inherited value. So the value behind of gold coin is of gold. This could be used as a money. I could exchange money for any good, then I could take that money and exchange it with some other good. So this, in a sense, created a place for market. People can exchange now more easily. But carrying this pot of gold is still bulky. So what government did, they introduced paper currency. Now, paper currency does not have a value in such. It's just a piece of paper. Value lies in the underlying guarantees which a issuing authority provides. In case of India, it's RBI. So this 2000 rupee note, as such, doesn't have a value. If you look at this note very carefully, it will be written that I promise to pay the bearer sum of 2000 rupees. I don't know, but somewhere behind this might have been true. Nowadays, there's no guarantee. At least for US dollar, there's no guarantee. Previously, it was linked to gold. Now, if you go to an RBI and you say, oh, look, I have a 2000 rupee note and please give me something worth of 2000 rupee, they give you just a 2000 rupee note back. They won't give you a gold coin. So it's only guarantee in a mind of a user. There's no guarantee as such. So this whole system works only if you trust the centralized agency. But there have been cases when the central agency have failed, and have failed very badly. So we'll come to that. And then to even reduce the load of your paper money, people start using smart card. But the still smart contract is like umbrella term for ATM card, debit card, credit card, gift card. But even these cards have this centralized agency. Now, coming to the point where this centralized agency failed, the first example on the rightmost side is of Lehman Brothers. It was an investment banking company. People trusted it with their money. They used to invest it, give a higher return for the investor. But in 2008, they failed badly. And they were doing very risky investment in hope for a larger profit. And then the subprime mortgage crisis hit and they failed. Coming to a recent cases, you have heard in late last October that this PMC bank, this was a cooperative bank, and it also didn't follow it norms of RBI. There was NPA crisis, and RBI put a ban that a user cannot withdraw more than 10,000 amount from his account. A similar crisis was with Yes Bank in this March 2020. So these, if you keep on trusting this bank and these banks keep on failing you, there is problem with the system, and somebody have to find a solution for this problem. But finding the solution is not easy. I'll give you another case with this trust phase. Now, for these cases, you can still assume, okay, it was one bank, let's say a Yes Bank or a PMC bank, which failed, but our center of trust lies in RBI, which prints note, which gives this guarantee. And since it's owned by government, it might not fail. So to counter that argument, this is a picture from Germany in mid-1920s. This was a time when there was a hyperinflation after World War I. So what Germany did, in order to pay its loan to France, in order to put money in economy, it started printing money. At certain point, it have printed so much money that a loaf of bread was worth more than 1 billion mark. Mark is the currency for Germany. Now, you see, it's a case of a centralized agency, which was a sole center of a trust, which failed. There's another case of insider attacks. It's a case with Nirav Modi and a Punjab National Bank. What did he do? There has to be a transaction with within cross-country banks. You use mechanism like SWIFT. Nirav Modi was able to bribe one of the officers who issued him letter of credit, but didn't put it in register. Even a single small employee can play havoc, and now Punjab National Bank is sitting at a crisis of 12,000 crore rupees. So, so these are the motivating example where a centralized bank failed. And we want to have a solution where there's no centralized bank, it's decentralized. It's distributed in a sense that even a single party who wants to be part of a system can own a system. Now, in current scenario, let's say a decentralized would be, you have, instead of one RBI, you have 3 seats of RBI, but still power would be concentrated in the form of a few. So it would be an oligarchy case. We don't want oligarchy, we want a democracy. So it has to be distributed, transparent. Whatever goes in a system should be viewable to everybody. Anybody should come forward and point out and say, no, this transaction was not valid, it should not be there, there was a malicious act. So you can see the only problem with the Punjab National Bank was there was a lack of a transparency. Employee can do something and it might not be visible, which may lead to crisis. Pseudo-anonymous. So think of a smart card you're using, think of a credit card. Assume for a moment that your centralized agency is a trustable one. Compare it with the physical money you are using. If I give you 100 rupee, only you and me know that I gave you 100 rupee. It wasn't open for a public view. It wasn't open for a government to look at this transaction. But the moment you went to a digital bank, the moment you went to internet banking, the moment you went to a smart card, ATM card, sorry, debit card or credit card, it was in the view of government. Now government can check any transaction. It could trace the source of money. It knows where you have spent it. Now it's good in some sense, but it's not always desirable. I wanted it to be a system which is as close to as cash money with guarantees. I don't want it to be a system which has so much surveillance upon it. Another thing we want is the availability. No, the centralized system is prone to denial of service attack. There are ways to avoid them. You have a distributed servers, but still those are limited servers. If you want a system to be available always, you need that system to be distributed. A best network currently available is P2P network, like a torrent one, which would never be down. And then it should be secure. Now, security in a distributed network is an issue because everybody comes in and you don't know whom to trust, whom not to trust. So now we begin our lecture on what is blockchain and how it solves all our problems which we have highlighted till now. So let's begin with it. So put very basically and very succinctly, a blockchain is a cryptographically secured distributed ledger. This is like a shortest possible definition I could come with. And a block would be a tamper-resistant data structure. Now, what do I mean when I say it's a cryptographically secure and it's a distributed ledger? So let's come to it. By the way, if anybody have any doubt, feel free to ask in between. I want this session to be interactive rather than from one way. I don't. Okay, so am I still audible, right? Hello? Yeah. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So if you have any question, please feel free to ask in between. It would be more. It would be better to me that if I get clear doubt at there, then and there. Okay. So we're done with this. So coming back to what do I mean by cryptographically secure? Cryptographical security comes from three functions. First is the public key encryption, second is the hash functions, and third is the digital signature. Let's explain what are these. Public key encryption is a mechanism in which you map a physical entity to a digital one. So suppose there's Alice and you want to have a digital counterpart of Alice. In a centralized system, this is done by your account number. So suppose you have an account in SBI. What SBI always does is map your transactions with your account number. So if your account number is 123, it will say, okay, 123 have 1,000 rupee credited, 500 debited. So it always keep mapping it to your account number. So this mapping in a non-centralized system is to be done by a public key cryptographic system. So a public key looks something like this. It's a very long key which have an associated private key. Anything which has to be sent secretly or have to be decrypted is decrypted by a public key, and it could only be encrypted by a secret key. Secret key is only with the user. It's just like your username and password for internet banking, but it's much more complicated than that. And only you can prove that this public key belongs to you by use of the secret key. It's the mapping from a physical entity to a digital one. So for in case of a Bitcoin, your Bitcoin address is kind of your public key. So this is how a Bitcoin address look like. This public key comes from an asymmetric encryption mechanism in which you use to have two keys and encrypt with your public key. So suppose you want to log into a Facebook. Now Facebook would give its public key. Your password and would be encrypted with Facebook's public key. So even if there is a malicious entity present which could see all the network traffic, which could see whatever bits have you sent to Facebook. But since it's a encrypted by Facebook's public key, it would be all gibberish to that malicious entity. It will be able to understand nothing. Then only Facebook with its secret key can decrypt it. So we use this mechanism. Now, how this public key are generated, in essentially there are three functions. First is a generator function, which is a random function in this scenario, and it generates a public key and associated secret key. Then there's an encryption function, which is like of a trapdoor function, which takes your public key and anything X which has to be encrypted and maps it to a Y. Y looks like a pseudo random and a uniform randomly distributed in the domain. Then there's a decryption function, which is because F was a trapdoor function, so it takes your secret key and Y and maps it to the X. Two commonly used public key encryption mechanism is RSA, ECDSA. So there are two different underlying security assumptions between RSA and elliptical curve digital signature scheme. So let's begin with RSA. So underlying hardness assumption in RSA is the integer factoring problem. So integer factoring problem says that you cannot easily factor an integer. All you have to do is brute force. Doing better than a brute force is very tough. For example, if I ask you to factorize 299, it would be very difficult to guess. So let's try factoring this 299. How would I do? The only algorithm I know is that first I'll start dividing it by 2 and say, oh no, it's not divisible by 2. Let's start with another prime number. Try with 3, it's still not divisible by 3. I'll start with 5, not divisible by 5. Try with 7, try with 11, 13, until I get to the answer. So even for a computer, it have to do all the same steps again. So if I give you a very large number, let's say which have 2000 digits, it would be difficult for even for a high-end machine to factorize this. So a standard RSA uses like 2048 bits, and it's estimated that if quantum computers are not there, with the current best available supercomputer, it will still take more than the age of a universe to factorize that, which means you're pretty sure that your encryption scheme won't be broken unless quantum computer arrives. So for RSA, how do you do it? Your public key is n comma e, where how do you do is you choose two prime number, let's say P and Q. You calculate n as a product of P and Q, and you publicize n. So n is known to everybody. Only the central server, only you knows P and Q. So n is a part of a public key. P can be a part of a private key, but you need not to keep P safe. You need to keep only n safe. Then you randomly choose E. This is where the randomized algorithm comes from. You randomly choose E such that it is co-prime with phi. Phi is P minus 1 into Q minus 1. So it's a Euler's Torsion function. So you choose E such that it's co-prime with phi. You make E public. So E is also part of public key. Then you calculate D, which is E inverse mod phi. Now you can use Euler's GCD algorithm to calculate D once you know E, provided you know phi. Phi would only be known if you know P and Q. So D is a part of your private key. N and E are public. D is a part of a private key. Now, this is your generation algorithm. Coming to your encryption algorithm, suppose you want to encrypt any message M, all you do is raise M to the power E and calculate modulo N. So suppose you want to send me a text which is encrypted with my public key. I'll give you N, I'll give you E, and you give me C, which is M to power E mod N. Anybody who gets hold of C cannot decrypt it except the case when he knows D, and D is only known to me. So I'll calculate M as C to power D modulo N. Remember, both encryption and decryption are deterministic algorithm. We use here Fermat's last theorem, which makes C to power D equivalent to M to power ED, which would be M, because Fermat's last theorem says that P2 any in a finite in a field with generator G to power order of field is always G. Another public key encryption mechanism is Elgamal based system, which uses discrete log as a underlying hardness assumption. So discrete log hardness assumption says that if I have a group of order P is a prime, and I choose a generator G, and I choose a random number R and I give you G to power R, you cannot figure out R from it. So it's not possible to take a discrete log. Discrete comes from the fact that it's a finite field. Had it be a non-finite field like a real number, it would be very easy to find logarithm. So we already do our log problems in class 10, but in a finite field, this is a difficult problem to do. So an Elgamal based system will choose a generator G and a random number A as a secret key, and your public key would be generator G and G to power A. Since discrete logarithm problem is assumed to be hard, from G to power A, you cannot get A back. If I want to encrypt, I'll choose a random R. I'll XOR M with G to power RA. Now remember, calculating G to power RA is possible because I know R, I know G to power A. It's simple exponential in a finite field. And I'll give you ciphertext as C1, C2. Anybody who knows A, even though he does not knows R, still able to calculate M, because all he have to do is to calculate G to power RA, and in Boolean, XORing twice with the same number is like nullifying this XOR operation, because X XOR X is always 0. So given G to power R and knowing A, you can calculate G to power RA, which is C1 to power A. C1 and C2, you can get that M. So this is public key encryption mechanism. Why is this important? Because this would pave way to digital signatures, and without digital signature, creating a blockchain is very tough. Second thing was digital signature. So what digital signature does is a credibility of information. So suppose I want to say that Alice pays Bob 100 rupees. How do I know that Alice actually does it? So in a computer, so suppose I want to enter in my ledger that Alice pays Bob 100 rupees. I went to State Bank and asked its accountant to do this. He just enters it. He can enter anything. How do I know whatever he enters was authorized by me? Okay, nowadays they keep a physical copy, or if you use internet banking, you log in with your username and password. But in a decentralized world where there's no accountant, there's no central server, how do you actually know that only Alice did it? The way to do is, you have Alice, and suppose Alice want to give Bob 100 rupees. You map Alice to its public address, you map Bob's to its public address, you pick the amount, write this transaction that Alice pays Bob this amount, and sign it by Alice. Because Alice is the only one who knows its private key. If this transaction is signed by Alice, Alice did it. Now we'll try to design a digital signature scheme using public key encryption. It's look like a simple encryption of this transaction along with this transaction would be sufficient, but there is a malleability attack, because let's go back to Elgamal. Suppose this encryption of M. all I need to do is, let's say, multiply this C2 with some constant, and I'll be able to generate an encryption of closely resembling string. This is called a malleability attack. To avoid this malleability attack, and there's another problem. The another problem is that this encryption would be of the size of a plain text. Ciphertext will be size of a plain text. To avoid that, we use another thing called hash functions. So hash function is a mapping from an arbitrary long string to a string of a finite size, and it's like your digital fingerprint. Hash function usually have three properties. First one is that for any string, its hash is unique. Now this is not exact. This is correct. So every string hash is unique. So it's a one-way. It's a kind of a one-to-one mapping. Second property is, given a number x1, you cannot find x2 such that hash of x1 is equal to hash of x2. So it's called a collision attack. So even this is like remember the word, it's called impossible, because the statement is incorrect. A statement is incorrect in a sense that because your input is an infinite length string, output is a finite length string, so there will always be two x1 x2 such that their hash is same. But idea is that to make it computationally impossible to find such x1 and x2. And the third is, in general, you cannot find two x1 and x2 such that hash of x1 is hash of x2. So there's subtle difference between point number 2 and point number 3. Let's clear that. So suppose, let's assume a weak hash function. So a weak hash function would be, let's say, map a person to its birthday. So it's a mapping from arbitrary large set of people to a finite set, which is 365 days. So you are mapping each person with its birthdays. Now, first property said that for each person, it's his or her birthday is unique. So that is satisfied. Another property of a hash function that it's very difficult to invert is also satisfied, that given a birthday, you cannot find which person it belongs to. Now, think of a second property, that I gave you a person, I gave you its birthday, let's say 1st of January. Can you find another person whose birthday is same as 1st of January? Now, this is a difficult thing. You'll at least need 366 person, probably need 366 person to find out another person who have a birthday of a 1st January. Second is a birthday attack, which is like a lot more simpler. So all it says that you need to find two person with same birthday, but you do not specify which birthday it is. And this is a simpler problem to solve. So it says that you only need a 23 person to find out two person with the same birthday. So let's say how many person are in this Zoom meeting. So we have 59 person. It would be very difficult to, let's say I say my birthday is 1st January. It would be very difficult that in this meeting somebody has a birthday of 1st January, but since 59 is very far large than 23, at least two person in this meeting have same birthday. So usually when I'm in class, I ask people to raise their hand to speak out their birthday, and then before we reach 20, at least a collision have happened. It's very difficult to do in this Google Meet. So, okay. So how does a hash function looks like? Think of a statement like a quick brown fox, and this is its actual SHA-256 hash, SHA-2 hash. Now, if I do a small change here, let's say I change this F to a capital F, hash changes drastically. So this can be called as an avalanche effect. So changing a single bit in a input changes your hash very drastically. Another example, let's say I change from fox to fix and your hash is different. This gives you a power of immutability of information. Once I publish a hash of information, it's very difficult to change that information. And hash is a constant length. So now if I want to design a digital signature scheme, which is not malleable, all I need to do is, rather than encrypting a message, I'll encrypt the hash of a message. Given hashes are different when a message changes slightly, you cannot have this malleability attack. You cannot change M to C times M and then say, though, look, I have another encryption, because C times M will have a totally different hash than M. Yeah, I'm moving quite a lot faster. Another thing we use in blockchain is a Merkle tree data structure. So this is like an end of a cryptography. So Merkle tree data structure is basically even shortening your hash. So suppose there are 4 transactions. Each transaction have its own hash. So ideally, I need to publish all these 4 hashes to make sure that none of them is changed. But I can do a lot better. What I'll do, I take these first two hashes and calculate a hash of their combination. I'll take next 2 hashes and calculate hash of their combination, and I keep on building to this tree. Beauty is that once I give you a Merkle root, I cannot change any of these 4 transactions. Not only I cannot change any of these 4 transactions, I cannot even change the order of the transaction. And if one of the transaction is changed, I can trace its path at where the change have been. So because if you have this entire Merkle tree, and if I know the left hand side of the hash is not same, I can go back and say, okay, there's problem in left hand side, and slowly I can figure out where the problem was. This Merkle tree data structure is used to build blockchain. So now block in a blockchain, which I defined as a immutable data structure, is basically all your transaction listed, formed onto a Merkle tree, published the Merkle tree into a block. You put hash of a previous block. Why we do this will come soon. Then you put nonce. This is number used once, which is a random number for every block, and then you calculate the hash of the block. From the hash, you can assume that's an immutable data structure. Now coming to 2 points, why we are using hash of previous block and why you are using nonce. I want that immutability to last forever. It should not be that immutability is only in the last block. Or let's say I have 3 blocks with 3 block hashes, but if somebody comes and rearranges them, it creates a problem. So suppose there was Alice, his account was credited with 1,000 rupees and then she spends 500 rupees. This is a legitimate transaction. You have 1,000 rupees first, then you spend 500. But if somebody comes and jumbles this transaction such that Alice first spends 500 rupees, then receives 1,000 rupees, Alice violates some law because she spent something which she didn't have at first place. To overcome this problem, you want that chronology of the event to be maintained. To maintain this chronology, you want each of these blocks to be numbered. How do you number these blocks? You link previous block to the next block by hash of the previous block. So suppose if you did a change in the block number 1, hash of a block number 1 would change, which means hash of entry in the block number 2 would change, which means hash of a block number 2 would change, which means hash of block number 3 would change, so on and so forth, and the hash of the last block would change. So this gives you beautiful immutability, that changing a slight change, even one of the transactions done years back, changes the hash of the entire blockchain, and people can pinpoint, oh no, you have done this wrong. If they can actually figure out which block this malicious thing was done. From this figure, you can give an analogy between a blockchain and a notebook. Each block could be considered as a page of a notebook. these are binded in a order or numbered in a some order. So if you shuffle them, you'll know, no, on page number 5th have come before page number 4, so there have been some mistake. A blockchain gives you a beautiful analogy with ledger. Ledger is like your notebook or book. And to make sure that there is no centralized agency, you make a distributed network. So figure on the left hand side, first figure says it's a centralized agency where all connections have to be done with a single server. This is prone to DOS attack. Then there's a decentralized one where the owner is same, but then you put server at a different locations. We want owner to be different. So it's a totally distributed network where you have servers or nodes at a different location, and each node is owned by a different entity. Let's come back, stay here for a while and think of a problem which we begin with. We wanted to create a digital cash with no central server. So we have first problem of identity. We solved it by using a public key crypto system. We had the problem of authorization. We used digital signature to solve this. Then there is a problem of integrity. Problem of integrity is that how do we decide what goes on the ledger? Because we know once it's on the ledger, it's immutable. But how do we decide what goes on the ledger? So this is a problem which is solved by consensus. Consensus is who can write on the ledger, and we need to answer this question. Until we answer this question, that who can write on the ledger has no meaning, because anybody can come and write any garbage on it. So assume a ledger like a blackboard, right there and open. It's accessible to anybody. In the sense, it's a truly decentralized. But then how do you know which guy have a chalk, and does he write is any sensible thing or any valid thing or not? Formally defined, a consensus would be there are two users, Alice and Bob. Alice have a blockchain, Bob have a blockchain. And how do we know that entries on both blockchain, Alice and Bob, are same? They're identical. Unless they are identical, this blockchain does not have a meaning. The most common solution which comes to our mind is by voting. So suppose I want to write something on a ledger. I want to write that Alice gave Bob 100 rupees. I prepare this transaction. Let's say Alice prepared this transaction, signed it. Now, remember, Alice is the owner of a private key, but Alice could be malicious. Alice could say anything. Alice could say that she have given Bob 10,000 rupees, a million rupees. How do you know this? Alice tells truth. Everybody have account balance of Alice. If Alice actually have a million rupees, she can give it to anybody she want. So how do we test that Alice actually have a million rupee in her account? We ask every node which have kept this blockchain to check their blockchain and say whether actually Alice have this. And once everybody have voted, we'll count the vote and we'll take the majority of the votes. If the majority says that Alice indeed have a million rupee in her account, we say this transaction is valid. But remember, it's a digital age and it's very easy to hack a computer. It's very easy to have a simulation of a computer, or I can use my computer to launch multiple VMs, which each of them would be acting as a different node. So Alice can actually get hold of a majority of the node. So even though Alice won't be having a million rupee in her account, but the majority will say, no, Alice had this account. This is called a Sybil attack, where attackers frame itself as a multiple entities, and then you cannot have this simple voting based protocol. And it turns out it's difficult to solve this. What Satoshi Nakamoto in its paper for the blockchain did was a truly marvelous thing, was that he said that we cannot count vote. We'll have to use something which cannot be faked. He comes with one such thing that cannot be faked is computation power. So we'll come to that, but first we'll say that how to handle the cyber attacks. There have been three main methodology. First one is the restricting the network, that you only allow verified user to come in. Second one is you only allow, so the second one was you only allow verified user to come in. The first one was you only allow verified user to vote. The third one was you allow anybody to vote, which is like Satoshi's protocol, but then they have to use something that they cannot fake, which is computational power as by Satoshi. There are other such protocols which have come forward, but question is, how do I test that you are not faking your computational power? Answer is, I give you something to solve. I give you something to compute. If you can compute that, I'll calculate, I'll measure the time you have taken for that computation, and I'll estimate your computational power there. Thing is, every time I have to give you a new thing to compute, and that thing should be hard to compute. I cannot give you just to find a multiple of tools, because you would be doing in order one time, and that would not be a measure of your computational power. I have to give you something which is hard to compute. We have seen two things which are hard to compute. One is factorization of integer is hard to compute. Second is discrete log is hard to compute. Problem with both of them is I have to give you a new solution, a new problem every time. Now, this consensus problem would reduce to who will give that problem every time. So this is not a solution. We'll have to come up with a problem which regenerates itself again and again, and there's a consensus on the problem posted. So Satoshi said that all you have to do is to create a block such that it have leading n zeros, let's say leading 50 zeros. Now calculate a hash which has a leading 50 zeros. He said that you took a Merkle root, which is not changing. You took a hash of a previous block, which is not changing. You start using a random number called nonce, number used once. Based on these three, you calculate hash of a block. If your block does not have, if hash of your block does not have leading, let's say 50 zeros, what you do, you change your random number. You keep on changing your random number unless you get leading 50 zeros. Because hash almost work as a pseudo random function, to get a leading 50 zeros, you'll have to take at almost 2 to the power 50 samples. Taking 2 to the power 50 samples need computation power. You cannot fake this. So even if I have, let's say, a machine, I run 4 VMs on this, computational power of those 4 VMs combined would be equivalent to computation power of my single machine. So it doesn't allow me to fake anything unless I invest in 2 machines. If I invest in 2 machines, I'll have a larger computation power, but then I'm investing in the blockchain network, and I don't want to play fool with a network in which I have invested money. So here we describe what's a proof of work. It's called proof of work because you are doing some work to reach a solution. Another important thing of this proof of work is that it's very easy to verify your solution. So you give me a Merkle root, you give me hash of a previous block, you give me nonce. I can easily verify in order one time whether the hash calculator will have a leading 50 zeros or not. So for a verifier, almost no computation power is used. For a prover, a hell lot of power is used. When Satoshi launched a Bitcoin, this computation could be done on a simple PCs. That 2011-12, you need to have GPUs. Right now, you need to have very dedicated miners. That's why you say that only few people or few agencies do mining in a Bitcoin network, because you need a dedicated hardware, right? The last time I checked last year, you need to have 76 zeros, leading zeros in a hash of a block, which means you need to have 2 to the power 76 computations. Remember that your previous encryption algorithm you used to have 2 to power 128-bit security. So you'll almost brute force them in sometimes if this computation power keeps on growing. Also, what Satoshi did was that he kept on varying the strength of puzzle. So he says that he need a block to be mined in roughly 10 minutes. So every 2 weeks, these miners comes and check that what was the block mining rate. If it's greater than, if its mining is faster than 10 minutes, so it's, let's say, mine in 5 minutes, they'll increase the number of the zeros needed in a block. So if what you were mining in 5 minutes instead of 10, number of zeros would be increased from 76 to 80. If you're mining in 15 minutes instead of 10, they'll reduce this computational strength, the computational complexity of the puzzle. Another kind of a consensus mechanism is a Byzantine fault tolerant mechanism. So a Byzantine attack is defined in this way, that there's a city called Byzantine and you are attacker. You want to attack the city. You have your general and your army is situated at a different nodes. You know it for sure that if you all do a coordinated attack at the same time, you'll win. But if some of you attack at one time and some of you attack at a different time, you'll probably lose. But the problem here is that the messenger which sends the message to another general is unreliable. Unreliable in the sense that it could be malicious, unreliable in the sense that it could be captured by enemy. You don't know for sure that your message have reached to another general. Now, different generals based on their location, based on perception, may propose a different time of attack. So unless there is a consensus on this attack, you'll lose. Same analogy is used in consensus in a distributed network. Let's say in a blockchain, which is a kind of a distributed network. If you have a block and you want to know that everybody agrees on every transaction of this block, they need to vote. They need to send a messenger that, okay, I agree on this. But then, like in this Byzantine attack, that your messenger is unreliable, your network is unreliable too. That you do not know whether your message will reach in time, it will reach at all. So you need to have this consensus. Now, to give an example that it's a difficult thing to do, suppose you are only two party, Alice and Bob, two general, and Alice want to say Bob that let's attack at 6 a.m. in morning. In a simplest scenario, Alice will send a messenger to Bob, okay, let's attack on 6 a.m. At this point, Alice doesn't know whether Bob received this message or not. What can she do? She'll say, Bob, whenever you receive this message, send me a message back. So Bob receives this message. Bob knows that, okay, attack time is 6 a.m. and he sends message back. Now, when he sends message back, he's not sure whether Alice received this message or not. So if Alice doesn't receive this message, Alice doesn't know whether Bob received first message or not, and she won't attack. Now, suppose Alice receives this message, second message. Alice wants to make sure that Bob knows she received this message. She'll send another message, and the cycle will go on, and nobody would ever be sure. So for two generals, reaching a consensus in a Byzantine system is a impossibility. You need at least 3 parties, and it has been proven that in order to reach consensus, at most 1/3 of them could be malicious. Malicious here means that 1/3 of the general can send different messages to different people. So it can say Alice that attack at 5 a.m. It can say Bob that attack at 5 p.m. in night, and it want to confuse an army. So even if 1/3 of them are malicious, strictly less than 1/3 are malicious, but rest of the general are honest, it's possible to reach a consensus mechanism among the honest general, not counting for the malicious one. But then this consensus would be a probabilistic one. There's an impossibility result which says that it's impossible to reach such consensus, but then it's only in very few cases, it's a corner cases. So all current system assumes that the probability of reaching such consensus is high, and they work on that. So I said that the first option, restricting the network on who can vote, it's a like you allow only known parties to join a network so that they cannot launch a Sybil attack, and then you reach a Byzantine consensus on that network. The second option, which Elastico uses, is based on a sharding mechanism. So a sharding mechanism is one in which a single blockchain itself is partitioned into multiple shards. And now, because even though if you ensure that less than one third are malicious, a shard can have more than one third malicious nodes. So you keep on shuffling those nodes. So each time a shuffling happens, you need to do a proof of work to join that shard. By doing this proof of work, you ensure that more or less than one third of the nodes are non-malicious. As you can see that Byzantine agreement was also a probabilistic one. Proof of work is also a probabilistic one. Any such probabilistic algorithm leads to forking. What is forking? It means that suppose you have this as a latest node of your blockchain. Then there was a guy who mined another block, but this was a genuine block. It might reach to some participant in the network. It might not reach to another participant. The other participants who have not heard of this block will keep on mining and will generate another block. Now there are two blocks in the head, on the tip of the blockchain. Which of these blocks to be accepted? And remember, both of these blocks are a genuine block. None of them is a malicious block. It just happened that one of the parties didn't hear about the previous block and it kept on mining. Not to have invested some power, you cannot you cannot stop him from getting its genuine dues. So in Bitcoin, how this is resolved is by a rule called accept the longest chain. So a party who sees both of these blocks will keep waiting until there's another block mined on the top of one of these blocks, and then it will accept that chain. It can happen then there's another party which mines on the top of this block also. How do you do it? Because it's a probabilistic algorithm, eventually one of these chain would win, and then you will accept the longest chain, and in this way a consensus is reached that okay, accept the longest chain. The chain which has not been accepted is called an orphaned one, and people doesn't get a reward on this. Okay, so there's a notion of a reward in a mining based blockchain. So why reward is given is that you're wasting too much of your electricity, you're investing too much money in getting a dedicated hardware, and then you are using them create a hash power to mine these blocks. You need to get some incentive to mine these blocks. Unless and until you get this incentive, you won't be inclined, anybody won't be inclined to mine these blocks. So how do they do it? There are two kinds of reward. First is at every transaction you include in your block, you get some kind of money, transaction fees. Also, whenever you mine a block, you get some Bitcoin as a reward. So it's said that Bitcoin is mined. It's because Bitcoin can only be created while you are mining. It cannot be created otherwise, as it's not like RBI, you can print a lot of money. It can only be created when you mine a block. Previously, when a Satoshi started, a block mining would give you a reward of a 50 blockchain. It's halved after every 4 years. Currently, I guess it's like 6.25 Bitcoin per block, 6.25 rewards. And this halving happened, I think, just a 2 month back or 1 month back. So then there's a 51% attack. 51% attack says that suppose there's a miner who invested so much that it get hold of more than 51% of the hashing power. So now if he has more than 51% of the hashing power, he can actually subdue this 51% longest chain rule and keep on mining on his own chain. So suppose there's one chain which was a genuine chain, a longest chain, but this miner then comes, he have a more hashing power, he'll mine this block faster, and eventually he'll win, and eventually his chain would be longest chain, and people, because of this longest chain rule, would have to accept his chain, which means this chain would be accepted. All those honest miner will lose their rewards. All those transactions which were in honest nodes won't be included, or only the transaction in this malicious chain would be included. This is mining power distribution among Bitcoin nodes. So this is an average of last 4 days I've calculated. So what is a mining pool? Because a single entity won't be able to mine that effectively in a Bitcoin network, because you need a hell lot of a mining power. So what people have done, they have come to form a pool. So each pool will act as a combined mining power. Even if the one member of this pool is successful in solving this puzzle, the reward would be distributed in each of those members. So in doing this, if you form a pool, there's a better probability of you for getting a reward rather than if you join individually. At one point in the past, I think in 2016, there was a time when one of the Ant pool, get hold of 51% of the hashing power, but then these were genuine nodes. So what they did, they shut down some of their machines and reduced their mining power, so that the good faith prevails in a Bitcoin, and people still trust this Bitcoin protocol. So as you can see that people are not always convinced with proof of work consensus mechanism, because it consumes a lot of energy. Until I think the total energy consumed by Bitcoin mining is more than the energy consumed by a smallest nation like Denmark. So people always come with new variety of consensus algorithm. So proof of work is one of them. Then there's a proof of stake. Proof of stake says that if you have invested in a blockchain, you'll be given a voting rights, and your voting right will be proportional to the amount of the cryptocurrency you hold. This is like similar to the proof of work. You cannot fake the amount you have in a blockchain network. Since you cannot fake an amount you have and you do not want to lose a value, you won't act maliciously. Then there's a delegated proof of stake, which says that if you have a money invested in a blockchain, either you can mine and you can ask some other nodes to mine in on behalf of you. Then there are Paxos based consensus algorithm. Paxos and Raft are like deterministic consensus algorithm. Deterministic algorithm are not Byzantine fault tolerant, but if you can create a situation in which there are no malicious entities, then these algorithms works well. So one of the idea would be Hyperledger Fabric. And Hyperledger Fabric, because execution of a smart contract is done only by endorsers, and endorsers are trusted nodes in general, you do not need a Byzantine fault tolerant or a probabilistic consensus algorithm. So you use Raft and Paxos derivatives. A round robin would be simple, that choose a one in random and ask him to mine. This would, if the majority is still honest, it would be an honest one. But then the inclusion of the people would be based on proof of work. You cannot ask people to launch a Sybil attack. And these are some other derivatives of a consensus mechanism. Right now, we are focusing only on the Bitcoin, but even if there's any kind of a blockchain, it's prone to several attacks. One of them is a network partitioning attack. A network partitioning attack happens when an attacker sits in between and avoids the communication between two parts of a node. Or it can happen like some natural calamities. So suppose something happens and this transatlantic optical fiber cable breaks down. So there would be, suppose a communication between US and Europe breaks down. maybe because of a war, maybe because of some natural calamities. So a node in US won't know what is happening in Europe, but these two would be on two different network of a same blockchain, which have same genesis block. Because of this, people will keep on mining, they'll keep on adding blocks. But at some point, when this connectivity is restored or when attack goes down, people will find that their blockchain have actually forked, they have worked on a blockchain and they were totally oblivious of another party. This can happen in any network. So your blockchain mechanism should have a reconciliation protocol which says that what happens when such merger happens. Bitcoin uses longest chain rule, but you can use some other rule also. Then problem of anonymity. So when Bitcoin came, it says that it solved problem of anonymity in a digital world. So remember I told you about the problem of anonymity is that when I gave you a 100 rupee note, only you and me knows that I gave you. Nobody else knows. In a centralized server mechanism like of a state bank knows that I have given you 100 rupees. Bitcoin, because it uses a public key mechanism, I can randomly generate n number of my public keys. I can transfer money from one public key to another. I can transfer money to you, and people observing, people seeing this transaction will only see amount going from one public key to another. And because I don't have to provide you a physical copy of my identity, I don't have to certify that this public key actually is linked to me, you cannot trace it. So Bitcoin claim this anonymity, but it's not actually anonymous. People have found some attacks like when you do a transaction, you propose a transaction, it has to originate from your IP address, or because I can read a chain, I could actually form a graph and I could find out the source of your Bitcoins. So it's a pseudo anonymous. It cannot be exactly links, but then you can have some idea where is the flow of money. So right now we discussed about blockchain 1.0, which is basically Bitcoin. Blockchain 2.0 is similar to 1.0 except with the facility of a smart contract, and blockchain 3.0 is yet to be defined, but mostly it will have DApps. A DApp is like a decentralized internet. So right now your browser, let's say Google Chrome or Safari or Mozilla Firefox, it is programmed to be connecting to you to the internet. When blockchain 3.0 arrives, these browsers would be able to connect to a blockchain network directly. So let's come to blockchain 2.0, which is a blockchain which have a smart contract. So what's a smart contract? So Vitalik came with this idea that if there is a ledger on which there is a consensus, it need not to store only transactions. It can be used to store also programs. So program would be one of the transactions that I put this program on a blockchain. Then people can also execute this program. And the result of the execution could be modeled as a transaction and put on a blockchain. There comes a smart contract. Beauty of this is that nobody can change this code. Nobody can fake the execution of this code because there would be a consensus. So how does a smart contract works? Two user comes, and it's a contract like user contract. So suppose I want to build a building and I want to hire a contractor that you build this building and I'll give you 50 lakhs or something. So a contract is like written in a programmable language. It's put on a blockchain. Then it has some triggers that it have to execute if such and such events happen in a blockchain, or if a certain user asks it to be executed. If a trigger is there, every node executes that smart contract, calculates its results. That result could be a transaction that, okay, this work has been done, now payment have to be made, or it could be anything. That transaction is then put on a blockchain. Important thing to note here is that everybody runs this contract and everybody should reach at the same result. So the smart contract cannot be written in a language which have a notion of a random number. So remember, all your programming language like Java, C++, C, you can actually have a random number there. Any such language cannot be used for writing a smart contract. So Vitalik created a new language called Solidity, which have no randomness inherited in it. And then if a code is written in that language, code would be executed in a sequential step, and if everybody executing that code would agree on the result, provided the inputs are same, which means your blockchain must also have a consensus mechanism. So you take an input from the blockchain, it's the only source of your input. There should be consensus on the latest block of the blockchain. Then you run this deterministic smart contract, calculate the result, and push it in a blockchain. Hyperledger Fabric tries, so this is called order execute model. Hyperledger Fabric tries to create a new model which is called execute order validate paradigm. So how they work is that they ask you to first execute rather than first have a consensus on a blockchain network. First execute your smart contracts. They have dedicated node called endorsers. These are the trusted nodes. They run this program, calculate result, create a transaction, and then send these transactions to a dedicated node called orderer. What orderer does is to create ordering of this transaction. Ordering means a chronological order. So the first this transaction happened, then that transaction happened, then this happened. So they create the ordering of the transaction, create a block, and then push these blocks to all the nodes. Nodes accept these blocks from the orderers, and then they keeps on verifying each of these transactions, whether this transaction could actually happen or not, or whether all the endorsers have signed this transaction or not. If a transaction is found to be invalid, it could be invalid for several reasons. One of them could be an endorser executed a code, and since the execution of the code, the state of the blockchain have changed. So this transaction would no more be valid. So each of these nodes validates each of these transactions. If a transaction is invalidated, it's still kept in the ledger but marked invalidated. It's not used to calculate the state of ledger. And sorry, and all these a block is formed by order. Nodes had this block. Same block is portion of blockchain. So smart contract could be used in variety of areas. It's used currently in digital identity. It's used in security. It's used in payment network, which is cryptocurrency. It's used in property transfer, goods supplied, or disease modeling data. Insurance sector. Okay, so this is our last slide I would like to have, which is called classification of blockchain. Blockchain is classified based on 3 categories. First is the network layer. Network layer says that, do you allow anybody to view your blockchain? Do you now allow anybody to participate in the consensus protocol? If you allow everybody, it's a public blockchain. If you do not allow everybody, it's a permission blockchain. Example of a public blockchain would be Bitcoin, Ethereum. Example of the permission blockchain would be Hyperledger Fabric, Corda. Consensus layer, which kind of a consensus mechanism used? Proof of work, proof of stake, RAF, PBFT. Or an application layer, whether it's only a cryptocurrency specific, or it's also allows smart contracts. So only cryptocurrency specific blockchain would be Bitcoin. There are other such things like Ripple and Monero, and smart contracts enabled blockchain would be Corda, Hyperledger Fabric, and Ethereum. Okay, so I did it in 1 hour. Hello.
Yes.
Hi. So I think I'm done here. So I'd like to have questions. If
Yes, I think we have a couple of questions, Ras.
yeah,
You can see in the chat box, or else I'll ask the questions.
Okay, let me go to the chat box. Okay, so I wasn't not able to see chat box before. Okay, so
I'll ask the question and answer for
yeah,
that. It's okay. The first question is,
this is there's a general notion that the cryptocurrency is not trustworthy as
yes,
there's no individual person involved in transaction. I think this notion is incorrect. Cryptocurrency is far more trusted than your centralized currency. Even it's more trusted than dollar. And to give you an example, that's a trusted. If it has not been trusted, a Bitcoin won't be worth of a 9,000 US dollar. People trust Bitcoin more than a US dollar. It's not in a hand of a centralized agency. And I don't know where this notion comes. There's no individual person involved in a transaction. So this is anonymity problem. Bitcoin was designed in a way that you cannot track a person who did this transaction. This is similar to the cash transaction. You are not able to track where this cash transaction happened. But this does not mean that the currency is not valuable. Value from the currency comes from the fact that anybody is not able to print that money. Unlike rupee, unlike US dollar, Bitcoin cannot be printed. You have to invest certain amount of energy in order to mine a Bitcoin, and your reward are half every 4 years. So they say that there could be only be 21 million Bitcoin. After that, no more Bitcoin would be mined. So it's far more trusted, far more valuable than a normal currency. I think Rakesh, I answer a question. If you have a follow-up question, you can ask right now. Then there's a question called, like in a physical banking, I know some extent who is involved in a transaction. Okay, so okay, I like to answer this in a way that if there's a transaction in a Bitcoin network from, let's say, a public key A to public key B, A would surely be knowing B. Otherwise, A would wake up one fine day and say that, okay, I'm transferring these 100 Bitcoin to B. It's not clear from the channel, it's not clear from the blockchain, but from side channel, they would be knowing each other. They would be communicating their public key to each other. Otherwise, you cannot have a transaction. So if I say to you that, okay, transfer money on this public key, I would have you trust me in a way that I gave you this public key. So it's not a totally anonymous transfer. Parties which are part of the transfer knows each other. Okay, so there's another question. Is there any specific algorithm for nonce generation? Is there is a way to improvise? I like to say there's no specific algorithm for nonce generation, because had there been an algorithm, this would directly means that the SHA function has been weakened. So SHA function is designed in a way that it's look like a random. And if you can have an algorithm which breaks this randomness even to a certain extent, this means that the SHA function is a weaker one. You will have to replace the SHA function. So right now there is no such algorithm. And I pray there's no such algorithm is found, because most of our computer security right now is based on SAR 256. Then, okay, so there's one more question which says that what will happen to the sidechain created in forking? So we have to look at two issues here. First issue is that what happens to the transaction in the sidechain? Usually the transaction in the sidechain are included in a further block. So let's say Ethereum blockchain is there. You have certain transaction in a sidechain, and you know that now the chain has been orphaned and these transactions are not the part of the main blockchain. Miner mining a next block would fetch up these transactions, include in its block, and then mine a block. Another thing which we need to answer, what happens to the reward of the people who mine these blocks in a sidechain? Unfortunately, those people do not get any reward. It's a drawback that people genuinely put so much effort in creating a block, But just because of a 51% attack, or just because they were not mining on the latest block, their block is not included, but they do not get any reward here. There's one more question which says that government of Telangana has used blockchain for maintaining land record. In that case, who would be miner to add block to the chain? Okay, so government of Telangana has indeed done a project on a blockchain based land record. In fact, we at IIT Kanpur is also doing a blockchain based land record. Generally, these blockchains are permission blockchain. So government decides which are to be nodes. In our implementation, which I can tell you, we have nodes which are a Tehsildar office, Board of Revenue office. We have a node at Department of Stamp and Registry. We have a node at the Office of Revenue and Settlement. These nodes undergoes a Byzantine fault tolerant consensus mechanism. There is no proof of work involved. And then they create a block. So block creation is faster. It's just like using a Hyperledger Fabric mechanism. I think government of Telangana uses Tendermint blockchain, which is also a PBFT based blockchain. And then there's can we apply in real application? Yeah, you can apply in real application. In fact, it's been applied. So coming back to land record application, government of Telangana is using it. The model the government of Telangana is using is very primitive, but then you can see the model of Dubai government. So what they are using is they are using Ethereum blockchain, and they create this notion of the fractional ownership of a property. So suppose you want to own a flat, let's say it costs 1 crore, but you do not have that much money with you. All you have are 25 lakh. So what you can do in Dubai is use this blockchain to own a quarter of a house. So think of it in a way that this property is converted into ERC tokens, ERC20 token maybe. Then you can buy some of these tokens and you can still be owner of a house. So this thing, which is not yet available in our country on the system we use in this country, but advanced countries have started using blockchain to solve this problem. Another area where blockchain can be used is a supply chain. There's a lot of problem in supply chain, especially when people want to know what is the source of the good. For example, nowadays in Western countries, people are very skeptical if a diamond you own comes from a process in which very inhumane conditions were used in the mining. They call it blood diamond. They don't want to use it. Or maybe you want to ship a good from China to India. You want to be sure that the factory in which that good was made was corona free. There was no worker tested COVID positive in the last 15 days. Only way to do this is a blockchain, because every other mechanism would be untrusted one. Another question here is, can I get some hints on how to address scalability? It's a major challenge. Scalability is the biggest challenge in deployment of the blockchain. There are ways to do it. One of the way you can do is to go for a permission blockchain rather than a public blockchain, because one hindrance in the scalability is proof of work. So if you forgo proof of work, your system becomes faster. Another way you can go for a scalability is to use sharding based mechanism. Here a blockchain is still divided into a minor blockchains, and because these are parallel blockchain which have the same security guarantee as of a bigger blockchain, but because they are smaller blockchain, you can have a faster block generation time there. These are mainly two mechanisms you use. You can use a faster consensus mechanism. So instead of a BFT, which is exponential, you can use a variant of a BFT, maybe a Tendermint, maybe this Raft. Raft is a deterministic one, so you can use it there. You can reduce the load on a blockchain. So instead of keeping exactly total data on a blockchain, you can just store a hash of a data and keep a pointer to where actual data is stored. So there is a blockchain called Medrec created by
people at MIT. So it stores medical record, but it does not store actual records. It stores the pointer where those records have been stored in maybe a Google Drive or a personal cloud. So in this way, you can can reduce the scalability issue, but it will still be an issue because it's a replicated database. So you are replicating our data again and again, and then there have to be consensus. So scalability would be an issue, but it could be tamed one. Then there's a question: is it possible to convert bitcoins into physical money after a long-term investment? There are crypto exchanges which do that, but you understand that Bitcoin have no relation with the physical money. But then because people value this, so it's Bitcoin something as a gold. You can convert gold to a money provided somebody is willing to give you that much money for a coin of a gold. Similarly, if somebody is willing to give you, let's say, $9,000 for a Bitcoin, you can convert a Bitcoin to a physical money. And there are crypto exchanges which do that. Those crypto exchanges not only convert blockchain to money, they can convert blockchain to Ethereum, they can convert Ethereum to Monero, and all these they do this. And then I think those were all.
Yes, Ras, the questions are fine, I guess. These are
Yeah.
questions. I think if participants, if you have any questions, you can put your mail to us. I think I'll share the mail ID of us later.
Yeah, sure.
So from the Department of Computer Science and Engineering, from the Vidyavardhaka College of Engineering, in association with Wing, I wholeheartedly thank for spending your valuable time and accepting our invitation for delivering a wonderful talk. Really, it was a fruitful talk for the participants regarding blockchain. Thank you, Ras. Thank you so much.
And thank you, sir, for giving me this wonderful opportunity.
Yeah, thank you.
It
Thank
was-
you. I'll share you the other details later, Ras. I'll talk to you later.
Sure.
Thank you. Thank you
Sure.
so much. Dear participants, kindly fill your attendance form and also the feedback form right now itself. We had shared the link there. Without fail, please kindly fill the attendance form and feedback form by 12 o'clock or we'll give 20 minutes of time. Please kindly fill the attendance and feedback form. Thank you. Thank you, participants. Please attend the afternoon session. We have one more person from IIT Kanpur, and we'll have the session at exactly 2 o'clock. Thank you. Thank you so much. Ras, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
You